This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 265 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. My take on targeting and avoiding players in fantasy football is that the latter is more important. Your consideration set should be pretty big when you're drafting, because there are going to be plenty of players who are relevant in fantasy football this year. It's the busts that you really want to avoid, especially in the early rounds and in the front half of your draft. I'll be talking about those avoid players on next week's show. I just wanted to preface with that because today I'm going to go over 10 players that I'm targeting in most of my drafts. They're not the only guys that I want, but they're 10 players that I'll likely have more of versus the public. And I've got details as to why I'm into each one so that you can understand the logic and reasoning behind it. Before talking about those players, though, I want to remind you guys about the $3.5 million Best Ball Championship over on Draft. With Best Ball leagues, you just draft the team and then you're done. There are no start-sit choices, no trades, there's not a waiver wire. Your lineup is optimized for you each week based on your players' performances. So you're getting the best lineup possible given the players that you have on your roster. For a limited time only, you can get a free entry into the Best Ball Championship when you make your first deposit. But you have to use promo code NumberFire. That's right, a free shot at $1 million just by using my promo code NumberFire. That's when you make your first deposit on Draft. Just search Draft in the App Store or go to playdraft.com. The first player I want to talk about today is Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens. We know that quarterback is replaceable in fantasy football. So when you're ready to take one in your fantasy football draft, just look for upside. Forget about the downside with a particular quarterback. Find a guy who has real top 5 upside. And I think that Lamar Jackson has that. Jackson scored at least 15.7 standard fantasy points in each one of his 7 regular season starts last year. And we know why. He's able to run the football. Now, across this stretch of starts, Jackson averaged 17 runs per game. He was adding 11.4 fantasy points per contest with just his legs. As we know, that type of production from a quarterback in fantasy football is a cheat code. As Rich Rebar once dubbed it on NumberFire, it's the Konami code. Now, since the turn of the century, so since 2000, we've seen 8 instances where a quarterback rushed for 700 or more yards in a single season. Lamar Jackson, last season alone, he only started 7 games. He had 695 rushing yards. But of those 8 occurrences, 7 of them saw the quarterback finish as a top 5 option in fantasy football that year. Now, I know what you're thinking. Lamar Jackson has to improve as a passer in order to hit that ceiling, and I don't disagree. But there's more juice in that Baltimore offense this year. They have Miles Boykin, who's super athletic. They have Marquise Brown, who can stretch the field. And they have second-year tight end Mark Andrews, who's coming off one of the most efficient rookie tight end campaigns that we've ever seen in NFL history. But I think what's most important about Lamar Jackson this year is Greg Roman, their new offensive coordinator. Greg Roman has a history of taking these athletic quarterbacks and making them into good passers. He coached Colin Kaepernick for 2.5 seasons. During that time, Kaepernick averaged 215 passing yards per game and a yards per attempt rate above 7.5. Those numbers both dropped fairly significantly when Greg Roman left the 49ers. And then the same thing happened with Tyrod Taylor. Under Greg Roman, Tyrod Taylor had a 7.42 yards per attempt average. Without Greg Roman, that dropped to 6.48. Tyrod Taylor averaged about 16 more passing yards per game with Greg Roman, and he actually had 7 more rushing yards per game as well. Both Kaepernick and Tyrod Taylor were much better with Greg Roman running their offenses. Now, coordinator data isn't everything. There are plenty of other factors that go into measuring the effectiveness of a quarterback. But I would say if there's one offensive mind to turn Lamar Jackson into a more competent passer, Greg Roman might be that guy. So I think Lamar Jackson is a perfect late-round quarterback target. Another quarterback that I like a lot this year is Cam Newton. I think there's sort of a misrepresentation of what Cam Newton actually did last year. And that's going to be a common theme with a lot of the guys on today's episode. But let's look at Cam Newton's 2018 season. He first showed up on the injury report last year for his shoulder after a big comeback victory against the Eagles in Week 7. That was his 6th game of the year. Up until that point, Newton was averaging 23.5 fantasy points per game. That was a top 5 number across the NFL. Now, after 2 more strong performances, Cam Newton played in that blowout loss against Pittsburgh. Everyone remembers that Thursday night game. During that game, TJ Watt crushed Cam Newton's throwing shoulder. Now, we can't pinpoint that single play and say that that's the sole reason that Cam Newton's season was derailed. But I think it's very hard to ignore it given what happened after that hit. Including that Pittsburgh game and through week 15, which was Cam Newton's last game last year, he saw his per game average fall by over 8 fantasy points. He went from being a plug-and-play starter to a guy that you were considering starting a streamer over. Now, just to reiterate what I just said about Lamar Jackson, we should just ignore downside and look for upside. Ignore the fact that Cam Newton still has issues with his shoulder. You have to just hope that his shoulder is looking a little bit better. And when you focus on the upside, Cam Newton absolutely has the upside. I just talked about how he was easily a top 5 passer when he was healthy last year. He's averaged over 8 goal line carries per year since he entered the league. Over the last 3 years, no quarterback has as many rushes within the opponent's 5-yard line than Cam Newton does. And over that time, only Dak Prescott has more rushing touchdowns. The difference is that Dak Prescott has about 700 fewer rushing yards than Cam Newton does since 2016. The rushing production is going to be there for Cam Newton. The question is, what about his arm? What about his shoulder? Well, there's certainly upside with his arm. Look at what the Panthers have. They have Christian McCaffrey coming out of the backfield, who's arguably the best pass-catching running back in the NFL. Last season, among the 16 running backs with 50 or more catches, McCaffrey ranked first in numberFire's expected points model on a per-target basis. And then there's DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel. DJ Moore was one of the best college wide receiver prospects that my prospect model has ever seen. And Curtis Samuel was charted by Matt Harmon as a very strong route runner last season. I talked about it on last week's mailbag episode. I think Curtis Samuel is a strong breakout candidate this year. And Greg Olsen is apparently feeling 100% as well. Basically, this is all coming together to be the best pass-catching group that Cam Newton has ever had. Now, that might not be saying much, but given what he's done throughout his career, that just tells us that he has plenty potential in 2019. Another guy that I talked about on last week's mailbag episode is Kerryon Johnson, and he's another player that I'm targeting right now in fantasy drafts. I love Kerryon Johnson's upside now that Theo Riddick isn't on the Lions. But there is one big red flag surrounding Johnson as we enter the season, and it's goal line work. Because last year, he only carried the ball twice at the goal line. LeGarrette Blount was the Lions running back who was carrying those goal line rushes. And LeGarrette Blount is gone. That's a good thing. But CJ Anderson is there now. CJ Anderson's another big-bodied running back. So there is some concern that Kerryon Johnson won't be the goal line back this year. And that's a pretty big deal because Darrell Bevell is now the offensive coordinator for the Lions. They're likely to be a more run-heavy team. Because when he was coordinating the Seahawks from 2011 through 2017, Seattle ranked 24th or lower in neutral script pass-to-rush attempt ratio 5 times. When games were close, they were a very run-heavy team. And there's some correlation between pass-to-rush attempt ratio and pass-to-rush touchdown ratio. So basically, if the Lions are more run-heavy, there are going to be more rushing touchdowns. And you want Kerryon Johnson to be the goal line back to get those rushing touchdowns. So that's the negative for Kerryon Johnson. It might not even come to fruition, but that's a negative. Fortunately, there are a lot of positives. He was super efficient last year. Efficiency numbers don't mean that much year over year in the predictability aspect of things, but he was very efficient. He's a good football player. The receiving production is really what I want to focus on, though. Theo Riddick had 74 targets last year, which accounted for about 13% of Detroit's pass attempts. The player who's going to benefit most from Theo Riddick being gone is most definitely Kerryon Johnson. Kerryon Johnson had a prorated target share last season of about 11%. So even if the Lions are going to be more run-heavy, Johnson's target share increase can easily make up for any lost volume, and more. And that's why Kerryon Johnson to me is so intriguing. It's not hard to envision a scenario where he does become the goal line back. But at the very least, he's going to provide a really nice floor for you week in and week out. That's especially true in PPR formats. So he'll give you a good floor, and if he does see those goal line touches, look out. So last offseason, I put together a study on spotting breakout running backs in fantasy football. If you listened last month to this podcast, then you heard me talk about this season's breakout running backs and wide receivers. And I went over the criteria in spotting a breakout running back. There are 4 things that breakout running backs generally share. 4 attributes. They're rarely handcuffs, they're part of ambiguous backfields, they're pass catchers, and they're on good teams. You know who fits the bill? Miles Sanders. The hesitation with Miles Sanders is that Doug Peterson's teams in Philadelphia have seen split backfields. Under Doug Peterson, the highest rushing share that a running back has seen in that Eagles backfield is 36.6%. That was done by LeGarrette Blount in 2017. Now, for some context, in 2018, 27 different running backs hit that mark. And across the 3 seasons that Peterson has been there, the Eagles are tied for 26th in the number of games where a running back saw 15 or more attempts. That excludes Week 17. That's not a ringing endorsement. That's not a good thing. But I will say, I don't think it's all that bad. If you look at the Eagles as a team, their average rank in fantasy points at the running back position over these 3 years is 13th. And they've seen the 12th most 10-plus point games from running backs across the entire league. Now, 29 teams have had more 20-plus point performances, but that sort of plays into this point. Philadelphia has been a destination for high-floor, low-ceiling fantasy football running backs. Miles Sanders has a chance to change that. I think there's an easy argument that he can. Because over these 3 seasons with Peterson, the most relevant Eagles running backs have been LeGarrette Blount, Ryan Matthews, Josh Adams, Darren Sproles, Wendell Smallwood, Corey Clement, and Jay Ajayi. Is it not fair to ask who wouldn't want to force a committee with those running backs? Miles Sanders has a legitimate shot to just be better than all of those players, that the team will want to force him onto the field. He enters the league with a very elite athletic profile, and after he was Saquon Barkley's backup at Penn State, he showed that he can be a do-it-all back during his final collegiate season. Compared to other runners in this year's draft class, his rushing production was fairly average. But only 4 running backs in this 2019 class had a higher final season reception share, or the percentage of team receptions. He's an all-around running back who has great athleticism. That's what drove his round 2 draft cost. But in fantasy drafts going on today, you're not really paying any sort of premium to get Miles Sanders. Over the last week on draft, he's been selected at RB35. And to me, considering the type of foundation that the Eagles offense is likely to provide, drafting him there and hoping that he's the back, that Miles Sanders is the back who breaks this committee trend, I think that makes plenty of sense. The last running back that I want to talk about today is Matt Breida. Now again, let's just revisit the criteria that helps define a potential breakout running back. They generally aren't handcuffs. Matt Breida is not a handcuff. They generally come from ambiguous backfields. The San Francisco 49ers backfield is indeed ambiguous. Breakout running backs are typically pass catchers. Matt Breida has about 50 catches over his first 2 NFL seasons, and he's been a part-time player. And breakout running backs are almost always part of good offenses. I think that we can feel at least a little bit bullish about this San Francisco offense with Jimmy Garoppolo coming back. I think Matt Breida, that makes him a perfect late-round dart throw. And it's not because I don't like Tevin Coleman. I actually like Tevin Coleman a heck of a lot at his ADP. But Coleman's never been a bell cow back at the NFL level, and the situation in San Francisco is awesome. It's underrated. Even though the 49ers were starting backup quarterbacks last season without a ton of weapons, the team's running backs still compiled the 5th highest yards from scrimmage total. They just couldn't find the end zone. They only scored 9 times. That was the 4th lowest mark across the entire league at the running back position. And scheme has plenty to do with it. Over Kyle Shanahan's last 4 seasons as an offensive coordinator and as a head coach, his running backs have ranked in the top 10 in yards from scrimmage. And even if you go back to 2008 when Kyle Shanahan first became an offensive coordinator in the NFL, and he's been coaching every single season since then, only one of his offenses has ranked worse than 20th in running back yards from scrimmage. That came back in 2014 with the Brian Hoyer-led Browns. And positive regression is going to hit the 49ers offense this year. In 2018, NFL offenses scored a touchdown for about every 140.2 yards. San Francisco was the 3rd worst at converting touchdowns last year, scoring on every 174.8 yards. That's likely to rebound because we see it rebound historically. It's regression. So talent, scheme, draft cost, a banged up Jerick McKinnon, and a little bit of math, that's what makes Matt Breida a strong late round target. The first wide receiver I'm going to mention today is Julian Edelman. Now remember, last year Julian Edelman missed the first 4 games of the season because of a suspension. But from week 5 through week 16, so every fantasy relevant game that Edelman played last year, he averaged the 12th most PPR points per game at wide receiver. In each of the last 5 seasons, Edelman's averaged at least 6.1 receptions per game in each season. Now, Julian Edelman's never been much of a touchdown scorer. He's most definitely a floor play and not really a ceiling play. But I do think that the loss of Rob Gronkowski could allow him to continue to see more looks in the red zone. Because last year when Gronk was just a shell of himself, he only had 8 red zone targets. Rob Gronkowski did. Only 2 of those came within the 10-yard line. And then Julian Edelman, meanwhile, had the 2nd highest red zone targets per game rate of his entire career. And he hit a high in targets from within the 10. And remember, he only played 12 games. So without as much competition there, maybe there's more touchdown potential for Julian Edelman this year. But at the very least, we should see a pretty consistent target share for Julian Edelman. Without Gronk on the field last year, Edelman's target share rose nearly 7 percentage points. In 2016, the last full season that Edelman played, his target share without Gronk went up about 5 percentage points. So even if we don't see more touchdowns this season, Edelman will still have the most predictable production in the game. He's going to be so consistent. And that's even truer with such little competition for targets in that Patriots offense. So right now, he's being drafted sort of as a mid wide receiver 2. I think he should be a high-end wide receiver 2 and a fringe wide receiver 1 in PPR formats. I think Christian Kirk is going to break out this year. Let's look at what Cliff Kingsbury did when he ran that air raid offense as head coach at Texas Tech. During his 6 years, his offense is ranked in the top 10 among all FBS schools in pass to rush attempt ratio in each season. And then to go along with that, they finished outside the top 10 in total pass and rush attempts per game just once. In other words, they threw the ball a lot and they ran a heck of a lot of plays. This is why it's very easy to fall in love with Kyler Murray and David Johnson. And it's also why you can fall in love with Christian Kirk, who has experience in this air raid system. Now, it's no secret that Arizona's offense was a mess last season. Actually, NumberFire's expected points model not only saw them as the worst offense in the league last year, but they were the worst offense since the 2012 Arizona Cardinals. But even with that situation, Christian Kirk was pretty good. He missed Arizona's final 4 games with a broken foot, but through the team's first 12 games, he had seen 18.4% of Arizona's pass attempts. That's a number that roughly 30 wide receivers might see per season. And he also ranked in the top 40 among all NFL wideouts in yards per route run, according to Pro Football Focus. And his yards per route run rate was the best on Arizona. It was better than Larry Fitzgerald's. And again, Christian Kirk was a rookie. Arizona just didn't run a lot of plays, and that hurt anyone in that offense. Only Miami ran fewer plays last year. The Cardinals ran the second most offensive plays while they were trailing last season, yet their pass to rush attempt ratio ranked 15th. Generally speaking, when teams are trailing that much, they tend to throw the ball more. And Arizona did not do that. Since the offense was so inefficient, they ranked 29th in pass attempts. That's part of the reason why Christian Kirk wasn't that relevant in fantasy football. But with Cliff Kingsbury's offense, Arizona is likely to jump to being one of the more pass-friendly, fast-paced offenses in football. I actually think we're going to see the biggest jump in plays run from one season to the next in NFL history. That means an 18% target share in this offense is going to be much, much more valuable than last year's offense. And considering how good Christian Kirk was as a rookie, we should just feel generally confident that he's a good football player. I like Larry Fitzgerald as a value as well in drafts. But Kirk, who's a second-year player who's not on the wrong side of his career, he presents far more upside. It's kind of strange that Allen Robinson has sort of become this boring pick. He's now just a veteran wideout being selected in the early to mid rounds of your draft. But he's still just 25 years old, and he actually didn't have a bad season last year. Now, he hasn't done what he's done since his second year in the league, where he had 1,400 yards and 14 touchdowns. And I get it, the Bears aren't exactly a pass-heavy team. They ranked 25th in pass attempts last year, and their pass-to-rush attempt ratio was 27th. Now, Robinson missed 3 games in 2018, so his total numbers don't look very good. But on a per-game basis, he did rank 33rd at wide receiver in PPR formats. And that was during a season where he was coming off a torn ACL, and he was on a new team, and that new team was run-heavy. So when you look at things from that perspective, it really wasn't that bad. And his peripheral numbers were a lot better than what you'd probably expect. In active games last year, 21.6% of Chicago's attempts were directed at Allen Robinson. When you look at games where he was off the injury report, that jumps to 23%. That's a mark that only 12 wide receivers were able to hit last year. He was the best wide receiver on Chicago in yards per route run, and according to airyards.com, Robinson led the team in average at the target, weighted opportunity rating, and air yards market share. And heading into 2019, I think that there's a chance that we see more passes from this Bears offense. Because a key reason that they didn't throw the ball that much last year is because they didn't have to. They only ran 313 offensive plays while they were trailing. That was the second fewest in the league. And that was definitely because of defensive play. Their defense was unbelievable. But that's not very sticky year over year. NumberFire's expected points model doesn't show a lot of stickiness year over year on the defensive side of the ball. Part of that is just due to natural regression, but it's also just difficult to repeat these high-end feats in the NFL. It's very difficult to be that good year over year. So let's bring it all together. Allen Robinson now has a year under his belt with the Bears. He's not coming off a major injury. His usage is already really good, and Chicago should throw the ball more than they did last year. That's why I think he can far exceed his current ADP. Now, hearing this player's name is going to annoy some people, but I think that Sammy Watkins is actually a great value right now. Like a lot of the players that I talked about today, Sammy Watkins' 2018 season seems a little bit misunderstood. Of course, he dealt with injuries. He always deals with injuries. That's the downside of Sammy Watkins. But I think we might have just been a year early on Sammy Watkins last year. Because in 2018, Watkins played 75% or more of Kansas City snaps in 8 regular season games and 2 playoff games. In those 10 total games, he averaged 0.4 targets fewer than Tyreek Hill. He actually averaged more receptions than Tyreek Hill. Of course, Tyreek Hill had more touchdowns and yards per game because he's super efficient. But Sammy Watkins' target share wasn't far off at all from Tyreek Hill's. The touchdown piece is where I think things could swing into Watkins' favor a little bit more in 2019. Of course, Tyreek Hill is always going to be some sort of outlier. He's crazy good on a football field. But according to Mike Clay's OTD metric, or opportunity adjusted touchdowns, Tyreek Hill's OTD last year was 8.2. He scored 13 times, meaning he really outperformed in the touchdown column. Only Antonio Brown, Tyler Lockett, and Calvin Ridley saw a larger difference in touchdowns scored and OTD. Like I said, Tyreek Hill is going to be an outlier within a lot of metrics because that's the type of player that he is. But I will say that Watkins had the same number of regular season red zone targets per game as Tyreek Hill last year. And he had roughly the same number of targets within the 10-yard line. It's not like Sammy Watkins wasn't used at all when the Chiefs were close to scoring. Now, this isn't to say that Tyreek Hill is overvalued. He's not. You should be drafting him in the second round when you can draft him in the second round for the most part. I just think that Sammy Watkins has a lot more going for him than most realize. And comparing him to Tyreek Hill like that just opens your eyes and maybe allows you to see that a little bit more. Just because Sammy Watkins crushed your hopes and dreams in the past doesn't mean that he will in 2019. Especially since his ADP has dropped since Tyreek Hill rejoined the Chiefs. Right now, you can get him as a low-end wide receiver 3, but in that offense, in that Chiefs offense with Patrick Mahomes, he should be close to a higher-end wide receiver 3. Now, the last player that I want to dive into today is O.J. Howard of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I get it. His cost isn't that cheap. O.J. Howard at times will go in the late 4th round. And historically, tight ends going in those middle rounds, the 5th or the 6th round, they rarely live up to expectation. But this year, and I've been saying this all offseason, it just feels a little bit different. In the past, those middle rounds of fantasy drafts have been littered with these high-volume geriatric tight ends, the Delaney Walkers and Greg Olsons of the world. Tight ends who have been solid, but they're rarely elite difference makers at the position. And that's made it easy to target these young, ultra-athletic tight ends later in drafts. These guys who break out every single year. George Kittle, Travis Kelce, Tyler Eifert. They've been easy to spot, but not this year. In 2019, players like Howard, Evan Ingram, and Hunter Henry have seen their average draft positions rise. They're the clear tier after the big 3. But I really think that O.J. Howard belongs in his own tier, after Travis Kelce, George Kittle, and Zach Ertz. Now, Howard's only been in the NFL for 2 seasons, but in each of those 2 seasons, he's been able to hit a yards per target rate above 11. Now, like I said earlier, efficiency metrics only mean so much, but I do love looking at them at the extremes. They should get your attention when you're looking at the endpoints. You have to at least pay attention to that. Because over the last 8 seasons, so since 2011, we've had 5 separate instances where a tight end saw 30 or more targets while maintaining a yards per target rate of 11 plus yards. O.J. Howard owns 2 of those 5 seasons, you guys. Now you might say that that's not very relevant, and I would come back to you and say, well, it's not irrelevant. But at least consider this. There have only been 2 tight ends during this time frame, so since 2011, to have multiple seasons with a 10 yards per target rate. So a rate that's a full yard lower than what O.J. Howard has averaged. Those players are Vernon Davis, who's very good, and Rob Gronkowski. I genuinely think that O.J. Howard might be special, and that's not something that I'm okay missing out on. And a big difference between this year and last season for Howard is that aside from having more experience at a very difficult to learn position, there's less competition for targets in that Tampa Bay offense. Last year, O.J. Howard was fighting Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Deshaun Jackson, and Adam Humphries for looks. This year, Jackson and Humphries, who totaled 179 targets a year ago, they're gone. Humphries, who's primarily a slot guy, was especially impacted by O.J. Howard last year. After Howard's final game in Week 11, Humphries saw his target share increase by nearly 10% through the end of the season. Considering where the 2 players line up on the field, it's logical to think that the loss of Adam Humphries will only benefit O.J. Howard's volume potential given the experience elsewhere on the roster. It's really just O.J. Howard, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin there. And there's also a new coaching regime in Tampa Bay. Bruce Arians brings his vertical passing attack, and that's seen his quarterbacks reach career highs in average depth of target. Under Arians from 2007 through 2011, Ben Roethlisberger had an average depth of target that was well over 9 yards. He's hit that mark just twice in the 7 seasons since. Arians then went on to coach Andrew Luck in Indianapolis. That season, his rookie year, Luck had a career high 10.3 average depth of target. After Indianapolis, Arians went on to Arizona. He coached there for 5 years. You remember Carson Palmer in Arizona? He almost won MVP in 2015. Tight ends haven't thrived in Bruce Arians' offenses. But Bruce Arians also hasn't had anything like O.J. Howard before. With less competition and an offensive-minded coach who likes to throw the ball down the field, O.J. Howard has a legitimate shot this year to join the elite tier of tight ends. Now, before I let you guys go, I do have some players that I wanted to share who barely missed the cut. I won't be talking about them in detail like the other guys, but Dalvin Cook, Latavius Murray, Dante Pettis, Curtis Samuel, Darren Waller, Jordan Reed, and Greg Olsen are all strong bets this year. I didn't talk about them because I seem to like some of the other values more, but feel free to target those players as well. As a reminder, I'll be going over my players to avoid next week, so you won't want to miss that. And to make sure you don't miss it, make sure you're subscribed to the Late Round Podcast by searching for it on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And wherever you listen to the show, please do me a favor and leave a rating and review. And feel free to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Talk to you later in the week with the mailbag episode.